The arrival on Celo Prime. Brad Davis had always known that signing up as an intergalactic technician would lead to strange encounters, but nothing could have prepared him for his first mission on Celo Prime. As the shuttle touched down on the alien planet, Brad's heart raced. The atmosphere was vibrant, with deep shades of blue sky blending with emerald green clouds, and the towering crystalline structures of the Essilorians gleamed in the distance. These towering structures were more than just buildings. They were living entities, pulsating with life and energy. As Brad disembarked, his heavy toolkit hanging over his shoulder, he marveled at the unique world around him. His rugged appearance at 6 feet and 2 inches, with short cropped brown hair and a muscular frame, made him stand out, but it was clear that this was a world that thrived on the bizarre. Walking through the bustling alien market, he noticed the inhabitants of Celo Prime, lithe, slender beings with luminescent skin and wide, black eyes, watching him curiously. Though he had been briefed on their customs, Brad couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this assignment than the simple maintenance job he had been hired for. As he made his way to the central hub of the space station, he was greeted by Kira, a high-ranking Silurian who had been assigned as his liaison. Unlike the other inhabitants, Kira had a more human-like appearance, with short silver hair and pale, glowing eyes. Her voice was melodic as she welcomed him. "Welcome to Celo Prime, Brad," she said, offering him a slight bow. "We've been expecting you. There is much work to be done." Brad smiled, though he couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed by the sheer size and complexity of the station. "I'm eager to get started," he replied, glancing at the towering structure behind her. "Where do we begin?" Kira led Brad through the hallways, the metallic walls shimmering as they passed by. They eventually arrived at a massive chamber that seemed to buzz with activity. Machines hummed, and alien workers floated through the air, using advanced technology that Brad had never seen before. In the center of the room, Brad's attention was drawn to a strange device, a large cylindrical machine connected to several smaller tubes and containers. "This," Kira said, her voice filled with a mix of pride and curiosity, "is the lactation processing system of Celo Prime. Our females produce a valuable resource, and your task is to ensure the system works efficiently." Brad raised an eyebrow, the gravity of his assignment sinking in. "You mean, I'm here to maintain a milking system?" Kira nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, Brad. It's one of the most important systems on this station. The resource we produce here feeds and sustains millions across the galaxy." As Kira continued explaining the intricacies of the system, Brad couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Though the assignment seemed strange on the surface, there was a deeper purpose to his work, one that could make a significant impact across the universe. This was more than just a job. It was a responsibility that required precision and care. Before he could ask more questions, Kira gestured toward a group of Silurian females who had just entered the chamber. Their delicate forms moved gracefully, and Brad noticed how they seemed to emit a soft glow. Each of them smiled politely at Brad, their eyes filled with curiosity. "They are the reason you're here," Kira said softly. "Their bodies are unique, always in a state of production. It is an honor for them to contribute to the galaxy in this way." Brad nodded, feeling a mix of emotions, curiosity, responsibility, and the weight of his task ahead. "I'll do my best to keep everything running smoothly." As the day ended, Brad settled into his quarters, but his mind was racing. This was unlike anything he had imagined, and the journey was only just beginning. The hidden secrets of Celo Prime. The next day, Brad found himself diving deeper into the mystery of Celo Prime. After fixing the lactation processing system, he had earned the respect of the Silurian workers, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Kira had been more distant, almost as if she was holding something back. Brad sensed that there was more to this station than he had been told. After his morning rounds, Brad decided to explore beyond the official areas he had been shown. The space station was vast, with corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. As he walked through the metallic halls, he couldn't help but feel that the station was alive in a way, pulsing with energy that was both familiar and alien at the same time. He reached a section of the station that appeared to be restricted. The doors were marked with a strange glyph, one that he had never seen before. Brad hesitated for a moment, then glanced around to ensure no one was watching. His curiosity got the better of him, and he used his technician's access code to override the lock. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark chamber lit only by the soft glow of blue and green lights. As Brad stepped inside, he immediately felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was colder here, almost as if the room was separated from the rest of the station. In the center of the room was something he hadn't expected, a massive glass cylinder filled with a thick, glowing liquid. Suspended inside the cylinder was a Silurian female, her body still and serene. Brad's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen anything like this before. "What is this place?" he muttered to himself, approaching the cylinder for a closer look. As he examined the equipment surrounding the tank, it became clear that this was not part of the lactation process. This was something else entirely. The machinery here was far more advanced, and Brad could only guess at its purpose. He reached out to touch the surface of the cylinder, and as his fingers made contact with the cold glass, the suspended Silurian's eyes opened. Brad stumbled back, his heart racing. The Silurian inside the tank blinked slowly, her luminescent eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her expression, only curiosity. Who are you?" Brad asked, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him through the thick glass. To his surprise, a voice echoed in his mind. "I am Illyria." Brad froze. The voice was soft, almost melodic, and yet it wasn't coming from the Silurian's mouth. It was inside his head. "You're telepathic," Brad stammered, trying to make sense of what was happening. Illyria smiled, her lips not moving. "Yes, all of us are to some extent, but only a few possess the ability to communicate across dimensions." Brad felt a chill run down his spine. "Dimensions? What are you talking about?" "This station," Illyria explained, her voice soothing yet mysterious, "is more than a simple processing facility. It is a gateway to other worlds, other realities." Brad's mind raced. He had known that Prime was advanced, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "Why are you in there?" he asked, gesturing to the glass cylinder. "I am here by choice," Illyria replied. "I am one of the guardians of the gate. My role is to protect the knowledge that this station holds." "Knowledge?" Brad repeated. "What kind of knowledge?" Illyria's expression darkened slightly. "The knowledge of creation, the power to shape worlds, to bend reality itself. The lactation process you have been working on is only a small part of the station's true purpose. We harvest energy not just for sustenance, but for creation, for the shaping of new universes." Brad's head spun. This was too much to take in. "Are you telling me that Prime is creating new worlds?" "In a manner of speaking," Illyria said. "We gather the raw energy from the Silurian females, but it is not just milk that they produce. It is a form of life energy, one that can be harnessed to fuel the creation of entire realities." Brad felt his legs go weak. He had signed up for a simple maintenance job, but now he found himself at the center of something far larger than he had ever anticipated. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked cautiously. Illyria's eyes softened. "Because I sense that you are different from the others who have come before you. You are not just a technician. You have the potential to understand the deeper purpose of Prime." Brad's mind was still reeling, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Illyria was right. There had always been something inside him, something that longed for more than just fixing machines. He had always been drawn to the unknown, to the mysteries of the universe. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to help us," Illyria replied, her voice echoing in his mind once more. "The station is not as stable as it appears. There are forces from other dimensions that seek to disrupt the balance we have created. We need someone from your world, someone with your skills, to help maintain the gateway. Brad stared at her, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. This was more than he had bargained for, but deep down, he knew that he couldn't walk away from this. There was too much at stake. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll help you." A hilarious smile returned, and for the first time, Brad felt a sense of calm wash over him. "Thank you, Brad. You have made the right choice." As he turned to leave the chamber, Brad couldn't help but feel that his journey had only just begun. He had stepped into a world of infinite possibilities, a world where the very fabric of reality could be shaped and molded, and now he was a part of it. The discovery of the hidden chamber had opened Brad's eyes to the true purpose of Sailor Prime, but with this new knowledge came greater challenges. The balance between dimensions was delicate, and Brad would soon learn that his role in maintaining that balance would be more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The fracture in the gateway. Days passed since Brad's shocking discovery of Sailor Prime's true purpose. Every corner of the space station now felt different, as if the air itself buzzed with the weight of the secret he carried. The lactation processing system was no longer the central focus of his work. His mind constantly drifted back to the hidden chamber, to Illyria, and the unimaginable power she had revealed. Despite the newfound responsibilities thrust upon him, life on the station seemed to continue as normal for the other inhabitants. Silurian females gracefully moved about their duties, maintaining their delicate routines. Brad noticed the quiet reverence with which they treated their work. He now knew why. Each Silurian's body produced not only the energy that sustained far-off worlds, but the very essence that created them. Every moment here had a purpose, and every being contributed to something far beyond themselves. But it wasn't long before the calm shattered. Brad had been working in one of the auxiliary chambers when his communicator buzzed urgently. Kira's voice rang through, tense and hurried. "Brad, there's been a disturbance in the gateway. You need to come to the central core now." His stomach tightened. The gateway Illyria had mentioned, the one that connected to other dimensions, was in danger. Without hesitation, Brad grabbed his toolkit and sprinted through the long, winding corridors of the station. As he ran, the usual serene hum of the station seemed louder, as though the machinery itself was anxious. When he arrived at the central core, the scene before him made his heart race. The core chamber was vast, its walls covered in pulsating energy conduits that glowed with an ethereal light. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, a towering archway made of strange, shifting material that seemed to shimmer between solid and liquid. This was the gateway to other dimensions. But something was wrong. The normally stable arch was flickering, the light within it dimming and surging erratically. Several Silurian engineers were frantically working on the controls, but their efforts seemed to be in vain. Kira rushed over to Brad, her face pale with worry. "We've lost stability in the gateway," she said, breathless. "We don't know why, but something on the other side is interfering with our connection. We need your help to stabilize it before it collapses." Brad swallowed hard, trying to process the situation. The gateway, this link between worlds, was about to fail. He had no idea what would happen if it did, but from the looks of fear on the faces of the Silurians around him, it was clear that the consequences would be catastrophic. "I'll do what I can," Brad said, setting down his tools and approaching the control panel. The machinery here was unlike anything he had worked on before, but he quickly realized that it operated on principles he could understand: energy flow, balance, and precision. These were things he had mastered as an intergalactic technician. He began by recalibrating the energy conduits, his fingers moving deftly across the controls as he adjusted the flow of power to the gateway. Minutes passed, and Brad could feel a tension rising in the room. The flickering of the gateway was becoming more erratic, and the arch itself was beginning to crack, thin lines of dark energy creeping along its surface. Brad gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he tried to think of a solution. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his head, Illyria. "Brad, there is something you must know." Brad froze, glancing around the room, But no one else seemed to hear her. He closed his eyes, focusing on her voice. "What is it?" he thought, his hands still working on the controls. "The disturbance you are facing is not a random malfunction. There is something, or someone, on the other side of the gateway, trying to break through." Brad's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Who's trying to come through?" "There are beings from other dimensions, ones who cuff the power of the gateway. They have been searching for a way to cross into this reality for centuries. Now, they have found a weakness." Brad's mind raced. He had suspected that the gateway was more than just a transportation hub, but he hadn't imagined it could be a target for hostile forces. "What can I do to stop them?" "There is a fail-safe mechanism within the gateway," Illyria explained. "A series of protective seals that must be activated to close the gateway and prevent anything from crossing through. But once you activate them, the gateway will be sealed permanently." Brad's hands faltered for a moment. Seal the gateway permanently. That would cut off access to other dimensions forever. The Xalorians depended on the gateway not only for their survival, but for their mission of creating new worlds. To shut it down would mean the end of their purpose. But if he didn't act, something far worse could come through. Brad made his decision. "Tell me how to activate the seals." Illyria's instructions were clear, but the process was dangerous. The seals were located within the very heart of the gateway, inside the unstable arch itself. Brad would need to enter the gateway chamber and manually activate each seal, risking exposure to the volatile energy within. Kira approached him as he gathered his tools, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure about this? No one has ever entered the gateway chamber before. It's too dangerous." Brad nodded, his expression grim. "If we don't do this, the entire station, and possibly more, could be destroyed." With Kira's reluctant approval, Brad donned a protective suit and approached the gateway. The flickering had grown more violent, and the dark cracks had spread further across the arch. The air around the gateway was thick with energy, crackling like static electricity. As Brad stepped into the chamber, the world around him seemed to warp. Time itself felt fluid, as if reality was bending under the immense pressure of the gateway's power. He could see faint shadows flickering on the other side, beings from another dimension, pressing against the fragile barrier that separated their world from his. Focusing on the task at hand, Brad located the first seal, a small circular panel embedded in the base of the arch. His hands moved quickly, twisting and turning the mechanisms as Illyria's voice guided him through the process. One seal down, he muttered to himself, moving to the next. But as he reached for the second seal, a sudden force slammed into him, sending him sprawling to the ground. Brad gasped as the air was knocked out of him, but when he looked up, he saw nothing. The gateway flickered violently, and the shadows on the other side seemed to grow larger, more distinct. Whatever was on the other side was getting closer. Brad scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He reached for the second seal, his hands shaking as he worked to activate it. The energy around him surged, and the shadows pressed harder against the gateway, as if they could sense how close he was to sealing it off. With a final twist, the second seal clicked into place. The arch trembled, and for a moment, the flickering slowed. Brad didn't waste any time. He moved to the third and final seal. But as he reached for it, the gateway exploded with a blinding flash of light. Brad was thrown back once again, but this time he saw it. The shadowy figure on the other side had broken through. The being was enormous, its form constantly shifting and changing, as if it couldn't decide on a single shape. It had no face, no distinct features, but its presence was overwhelming, like a dark cloud of fear and malice. Brad's breath caught in his throat. He had to finish the job, or the entire station, and possibly the universe, would be lost. With a final surge of strength, Brad lunged for the third seal, slamming his hand down on the panel. The arch shuddered violently, and the light within it began to dim. The shadowy figure let out a deafening roar, its form flickering and distorting as the gateway began to close. Brad stumbled back, watching as the arch sealed itself shut. The dark figure vanished, and the flickering light finally stopped. The gateway was closed. He collapsed to the ground, exhausted, but alive. And so, the battle for the gateway had ended for now. But Brad knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The gateway was sealed, but the presence of otherworldly beings had left its mark on Selor Prime. Brad's journey was far from over, and the mysteries of the universe, and the dangers lurking within it, were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The aftermath of the gateway collapse. The days that followed the sealing of the gateway were anything but peaceful. Brad's heroic act of closing the gateway had saved Selor Prime from what could have been an unspeakable disaster, but it had also set off a chain of events that no one had foreseen. The station, once humming with a quiet and efficient rhythm, now buzzed with a tense energy. The Selorians, who had always seemed so composed, now moved about with an undercurrent of worry and whispered conversations. Brad sat in his quarters, still trying to shake off the events of the gateway collapse. His body ached from the strain of fighting against the chaotic forces that had tried to breach the station. Though the gateway was sealed, he couldn't help but feel the lingering presence of the being he had seen on the other side, a dark, malevolent force that had almost broken through into his world. He had been through intense missions before, but nothing like this. Closing his eyes, he saw flashes of the shadowy figure, its ever-shifting form seared into his memory. He could still hear the ominous roar that had filled the chamber as he sealed the gateway, the sense that something beyond his understanding had been watching him. And it wasn't just watching, it wanted in. A sudden chime at the door shook Brad from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, trying to focus. The door slid open to reveal Kira, her usually calm demeanor replaced with a tight-lipped expression. She entered quietly and sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap before speaking. "You saved the station," she began, her voice steady but filled with tension. "But there are consequences we're only beginning to understand." Brad nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "The gateway's closed. I thought that was the goal." Kira sighed, rubbing her temples before continuing. "It was. But now, we face an even greater problem. The beings you saw, the ones trying to break through, they were never meant to reach us. The gateway was designed as a one-way portal, allowing us to harness energy, but never allowing anything from the other side to come through." She hesitated, then looked Brad in the eyes. "But when you sealed the gateway, you didn't just cut off the connection, you trapped something." Brad's heart skipped a beat. "Trapped something? What do you mean?" Kira stood and began pacing the room. "That dark force you saw, the shadowy figure, it didn't disappear when you closed the gateway. It didn't go back to its dimension. It's still here, somewhere in our reality, searching for a way to break free." Brad stood up, the urgency of the situation hitting him like a tidal wave. "So, we didn't stop it?" Kira shook her head. "No, we delayed it. For now, it's bound to the energy systems of the station, unable to fully manifest. But it's growing stronger. We can feel its presence in the core systems. There have been power fluctuations, unexplained surges in energy, and strange sightings." A cold shiver ran down Brad's spine. Strange sightings. Kira paused, clearly uncomfortable. Some of the Selorians have reported seeing shadows, flickers of something moving through the halls, but when they turn, there's nothing there. It's as if the darkness is alive, watching, waiting. Brad's mind raced as he tried to process the information. The gateway had been sealed, but the entity, whatever it was, had crossed over, and now it was loose in their world. The thought of it prowling the station, unseen but ever-present, sent a chill through him. "What do we do?" Brad asked, his voice firm but filled with concern. Kira stopped pacing and met his gaze. "There's only one thing we can do. We need to find a way to expel it from this dimension before it fully materializes. If it grows strong enough to break free of the station's systems, it will be unstoppable." Brad felt the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had already risked his life to seal the gateway, but now it seemed the real danger was only just beginning. His mind raced through possible solutions, but nothing came to him immediately. He needed time to think. Just as he was about to respond, a loud, piercing alarm blared through the station, causing the walls to vibrate with its intensity. Both Brad and Kira jumped to their feet, exchanging alarmed glances. "It's the core chamber," Kira shouted over the sound. "Something's happening." Without another word, they bolted from the room and raced down the halls toward the central core. As they ran, Brad could feel a tension in the air growing thicker with each step. The shadows seemed to twist and bend around them, as if the very station was warping under the influence of the dark force. When they reached the core chamber, chaos awaited them. Engineers and technicians were running in all directions, shouting orders and desperately trying to regain control of the situation. The massive energy conduits that powered the station were glowing with an ominous red hue, pulsating as if something was trying to tear its way through them. Brad immediately rushed to one of the control panels, scanning the readouts. His stomach dropped as he saw the energy levels spiking uncontrollably. Whatever was trapped in the system was trying to break free. "We're losing control of the power flow," one of the engineers shouted. "It's overriding our systems." Kira ran to Brad's side, her face pale with fear. "It's happening, Brad. It's trying to break out." Brad's mind raced as he studied the controls. There had to be a way to contain it, to prevent the dark force from fully manifesting. He had managed to stop it once, but this time the stakes were even higher. If the entity broke free, it could destroy the entire station and possibly spread to other parts of the galaxy. As the energy levels continued to spike, Brad spotted a possible solution. There was a manual override function deep within the station's core, one that could isolate the energy conduits and prevent the entity from accessing the rest of the station. But there was a catch. Activating the override would require someone to enter the core itself, risking exposure to the dangerous energies within. Brad looked at Kira, his decision already made. "I have to go in. It's the only way." Kira's eyes widened with horror. "No, Brad, you can't. The core chamber is too unstable. You wouldn't survive the exposure." "I don't have a choice," Brad said, his voice firm. "If we don't do this, that thing is going to break out, and we'll all be dead." Kira hesitated, then nodded, her face filled with resignation. "I'll guide you from here. Just be careful." Without wasting another moment, Brad grabbed a protective suit and headed for the entrance to the core chamber. As he approached the massive doors, the station seemed to groan under the pressure of the dark force, as if it was alive and struggling to hold back the tide of chaos. The doors slid open with a heavy, metallic clang, revealing the core chamber beyond. Inside, the air was thick with energy, crackling like static electricity and distorting the very fabric of reality. The glowing conduits stretched up toward the ceiling, pulsating with an ominous red light. Taking a deep breath, Brad stepped inside. The heat was intense, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Every step he took sent a ripple through the floor, as if the energy itself was reacting to his presence. As he approached the central control panel, Brad could feel the dark force watching him, its unseen eyes piercing through the energy conduits. It knew he was there. It was waiting. With shaking hands, Brad activated the manual override, his heart pounding in his chest. The control panel lit up, and he quickly entered the necessary commands. The system began to respond, but just as he was about to finish, a surge of dark energy erupted from one of the conduits, slamming into him like a wave. Brad was thrown back, his body colliding with the wall as the darkness swirled around him. He could feel its presence, cold, malevolent, and hungry. It was trying to consume him. Gritting his teeth, Brad forced himself to his feet and stumbled back to the control panel. The darkness pressed against him, but he refused to give in. With a final, desperate push, he activated the override. The room trembled violently as the energy conduits began to shut down, one by one. The red glow faded, replaced by the familiar blue light of the station's normal operations. The dark force screamed in fury, its presence fading as it was cut off from the station's systems. Brad collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the weight of the entity lifted from his mind. He had done it. The station was safe. For now. The core had been stabilized, but the presence of the dark entity was still felt. Brad had bought them more time, but he knew this wasn't the end. The entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to break free. The fight was far from over, and Brad was ready for whatever came next. The mystery of the entity's origins and its true purpose would soon be revealed. The entity's revenge. 2 days had passed since Brad stabilized the core and prevented the dark entity from breaking free, but Stellar Prime had not returned to its former state of calm. If anything, the atmosphere had become more charged with tension. The engineers and technicians moved with haste, constantly checking systems for fluctuations. While the Solarians were unnaturally quiet, their usual serene expressions replaced by a collective unease. Brad had spent the last 48 hours confined to his quarters, trying to recover from the intense physical and mental strain of his encounter with the dark force. His body ached, and his sleep was plagued by strange, unsettling dreams, visions of the shadowy figure pressing against the walls of reality, clawing its way toward him. Each time he woke in a cold sweat, he was left with a growing sense that the entity wasn't finished with him yet. A sharp knock at his door pulled Brad from his restless thoughts. Before he could answer, the door slid open, and Kira entered, her face lined with exhaustion. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but urgent. Brad sat up, bracing himself for more bad news. "What's going on?" Kira paced the small room, clearly troubled. "There's been another incident, more sightings of the shadows, but this time, it's worse." Brad's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Kira paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "One of our engineers, Niall, was found unconscious near the core this morning. He had been working on repairs when the lights in the chamber flickered. According to the security footage, everything went dark for about 30 seconds, and when the lights came back on, Niall was on the floor, completely unresponsive." Brad frowned, his mind racing. Was he injured? Kira shook her head. "No physical injuries, but when we tried to revive him, he didn't wake up. It's as if he's trapped in some kind of deep sleep. His brain activity is normal, but he's completely unresponsive. We think the entity is responsible." A cold chill ran through Brad's body. "You're saying the entity is attacking people now?" Kira nodded grimly. "Yes, it seems that being cut off from the station's systems has only made it more desperate. It's no longer trying to manifest through energy surges, it's targeting individuals, trying to find a way back into the physical world by possessing or controlling them." Brad stood up, his exhaustion forgotten. "So it's evolving. We need to figure out how to stop it before it hurts anyone else." "That's why I'm here," Kira said, her voice tightening with urgency. "We need your help, Brad. You have a unique connection to this entity. You saw it, felt it. We believe that somehow it has fixated on you." Brad blinked, his heart racing. "On me? Why?" "We're not sure," Kira admitted, pacing again. "But the timing of Niall's attack lines up with your recovery. The entity might see you as a threat, or perhaps it believes you're its only way back into the systems. Either way, we think it's trying to lure you back to the core." Brad swallowed hard, a sense of dread washing over him. "So what's the plan? How do we stop something like this?" Kira stopped pacing and faced him, her expression serious. "There's one option, but it's dangerous. We've been analyzing the energy patterns from the gateway collapse, and we've discovered that the entity is still linked to the station's dimensional rift. That's why it's able to manifest as shadows and why it's targeting people. It's drawing power from the rift, even though it's been sealed." Brad's brow furrowed. "The rift? You mean the gateway I closed?" Kira nodded. "Yes, the gateway is physically sealed, but the dimensional rift remains open, like a scar in the fabric of space-time. The entity is feeding off that rift, using it as a bridge between its dimension and ours. If we can sever that connection, we believe we can cut off its power source and trap it permanently in its own dimension. Brad rubbed his temples, trying to wrap his mind around the situation. How do we sever the connection? Kira's face grew even graver. That's the dangerous part. We need to open the gateway, just for a moment. Long enough for you to go in and place a containment device at the center of the rift. Once it's in place, it will collapse the rift and seal the dimensional breach for good. Brad's heart sank. He had barely survived closing the gateway the first time, and now they wanted him to go back into the heart of the rift, where the entity was strongest. The thought alone was enough to make his skin crawl. What happens if I don't make it out in time? Brad asked, his voice tense. Kira hesitated, her eyes reflecting the weight of the answer. If the rift closes while you're still inside, you'll be trapped in the entity's dimension, permanently. Brad took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the situation press down on him like a heavy weight. He had been through tough missions before, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. Still, he knew there was no other choice. If it didn't stop the entity now, it would eventually grow strong enough to escape, and countless lives, both on Cellular Prime and beyond, would be at risk. I'll do it, Brad said finally, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. But I need to know everything about this containment device. Kira smiled, though the gesture was weighed down by the seriousness of their conversation. I knew you'd say yes. I'll brief you on the device and the procedure. Several hours later, Brad found himself standing in front of the gateway once again, wearing an advanced protective suit specially designed to withstand the intense energies inside the rift. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as its Alorian engineers made final adjustments to the gateway controls. The air felt thick, as if the very station was holding its breath. Kira stood by Brad's side, her face a mixture of determination and concern. Remember, the containment device is designed to activate automatically once you place it at the center of the rift. You'll have approximately 60 seconds to get out before the gateway collapses the rift entirely. Brad nodded, gripping the small, spherical containment device in his hand. It felt cold and heavy, the weight of their plan resting in his palm. We'll be monitoring the energy readings from here, Kira continued. But once you're inside, you'll be on your own. The entity will sense you the moment you enter the rift, so you need to move fast. Brad took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. Got it. With a final nod from Kira, the engineers activated the gateway. The massive archway hummed to life, the air around it distorting as the familiar shimmering light of the dimensional rift flickered into existence. But this time, there was something darker, more sinister about the light. It pulsed erratically, as if the rift itself was unstable, barely contained by the technology that powered it. Brad didn't waste any time. With the containment device securely in hand, he stepped through the arch and into the rift. The moment Brad crossed into the rift, the world around him warped. The familiar metallic walls of the station vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic landscape of shifting shapes and colors. It was as if he had entered a place where reality itself was fluid, constantly changing and bending in ways that defied logic. But there was no time to marvel at the strange surroundings. The entity's presence was immediately palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him from all sides. The shadows in the rift were alive, twisting and writhing as they circled around him, watching, waiting. Brad's heart pounded in his chest as he navigated the unstable terrain. His suit's sensors were going haywire, unable to fully comprehend the environment around him. But he pushed forward, his eyes locked on the center of the rift, a swirling vortex of dark energy that pulsed with a malevolent glow. He could feel the entity watching him, its presence growing stronger with each step. The shadows pressed closer, whispering incomprehensible words that filled his mind with dread. But Brad forced himself to ignore them, focusing only on the task at hand. When he reached the center of the vortex, the air crackled with energy, the dark tendrils of the entity reaching out toward him. Brad didn't hesitate. He placed the containment device on the ground and activated it. Immediately, the device began to glow, its energy field expanding as it linked with the rift's core. The swirling vortex shuddered, and the entity let out a deafening otherworldly scream, a sound that rattled Brad's very soul. He turned and ran. The world around him began to collapse, the rift closing in on itself as the containment device did its job. The shadows lashed out, trying to pull him back, but Brad pushed through, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the gateway. The archway was just ahead, the light flickering as the rift destabilized. With a final burst of strength, Brad dove through the gateway, just as the rift imploded behind him. The world snapped back into focus, and Brad landed hard on the floor of the station, gasping for breath. He had made it. The rift was sealed. But as Brad lay there, catching his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't truly gone. Somehow, somewhere, it was still watching. And waiting. Brad had severed the entity's connection to the station, but he knew this victory was only temporary. The entity had been weakened, but it wasn't destroyed, and as long as the rift had existed, there would always be a chance for it to return. His battle with the dark force was far from over. The whisper of the entity. It had been a week since Brad narrowly escaped the rift, severing the connection between Cellular Prime and the dark entity that had sought to cross into their dimension. The station's systems had stabilized, and the engineers, led by Kira, had worked tirelessly to ensure that no further dimensional breaches will occur. To the casual observer, life on Cellular Prime had returned to normal. The lactation processing system was fully operational again, and the Asilorian workers had resumed their quiet routines. But Brad couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. Despite their best efforts, the entity wasn't truly gone. He could feel it, like a faint whisper in the back of his mind, ever present but just beyond the reach of his conscious thoughts. The others may have believed the danger had passed, but Brad knew better. Something had changed during his time in the rift. The dark force had left its mark on him. Brad spent most of his days in solitude, avoiding the bustling halls of the station. He had tried to immerse himself in routine maintenance work, but even the simple tasks felt alien to him now. His nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by the same recurring nightmare. The rift opening once again, the shadowy figure reaching out to him with long, clawed hands, pulling him into an endless void. Each time, he awoke drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if he had truly been pulled from the brink of oblivion. One evening, as Brad lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a soft knock echoed through his quarters. He sat up, blinking in the dim light. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The door slid open, revealing Kira standing in the doorway. She looked as tired as Brad felt, her pale silver eyes clouded with concern. She stepped inside, her movements unusually slow, as if she carried the weight of a heavy burden. "I've been worried about you," she said quietly, sitting down across from him. "You've been distant." Brad rubbed his face with his hands, trying to dispel the fog of exhaustion that hung over him. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just tired." Kira's gaze sharpened. "You're not fine, Brad. I know what you've been through, and I know it's not something you can just shake off. But you need to talk about it. Keeping it all inside will only make it worse." Brad sighed, leaning back against the wall. He knew she was right, but how could he explain what he was feeling? How could he tell her about the entity's whispers, the sense that it was still watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? "I don't think it's over," Brad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entity, it's still out there. It's not gone, Kira. I can feel it." Kira frowned, her expression thoughtful. "We severed the connection. The rift is sealed. How can it still be affecting you?" Brad shook his head, frustrated by the lack of answers. "I don't know. But ever since I came back from the rift, I've had these dreams. No, not dreams, nightmares. And it's always the same thing. The entity is there, pulling me back into the rift, as if it's trying to bring me over to its side." Kira's eyes widened, and for a moment, Brad thought he saw a flicker of fear cross her face. That's not possible. The entity was cut off from our dimension. It shouldn't be able to reach you. I'm telling you, it's not gone, Brad insisted, his voice rising. It left something behind. Maybe it's inside me. Maybe it's waiting for the right moment to. Before he could finish, the lights in his quarters flickered. Both Brad and Kira froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling as the overhead lights dimmed and brightened in rapid succession. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the flickering stopped, and the lights returned to normal. Brad's heart pounded in his chest. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Kira nodded, her face pale. "It's happening again." Brad stood up, pacing the room as his mind raced. "It's the entity. I told you it's still here. It's trying to break through, to take control." Kira rose to her feet as well, her voice steady but filled with tension. "We need to get to the core. If the entity is manifesting again, it'll try to access the rift. We can't let it do that." Without another word, they rushed out of Brad's quarters and made their way to the core chamber. As they moved through the station, Brad couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed darker, more alive than before. His skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes following their every step. When they reached the core chamber, it was worse than Brad had imagined. The energy conduits, which had been stable since the rift was sealed, were now flickering erratically, pulsing with an ominous red light. The air around them felt heavy, charged with the same dark energy Brad had sensed in the rift. Kira's face tightened with worry. The entity is trying to access the core systems again. If it manages to breach the dimensional barriers, it could open the rift. Brad stepped closer to the control panel, his eyes scanning the readouts. "Can we stop it?" Kira hesitated. "We might be able to stabilize the conduits temporarily, but it's only a matter of time before the entity finds another way in. We need to find a permanent solution." Brad's thoughts raced. There had to be something they hadn't considered, some way to end this once and for all. He glanced at Kira, and an idea began to form in his mind. "What if we go back into the rift?" Brad asked, his voice filled with a sudden sense of clarity. "What if the only way to stop the entity is to confront it directly in its own dimension?" Kira's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious. The rift is too dangerous. If you go in there again, you might not come back." Brad shook his head, determined. "It's the only way. The entity won't stop until it breaks free. It's getting stronger every time we push it back. If we don't go to the source and stop it there, it'll keep coming." Kira looked torn, but after a long pause she nodded. "If you're right, then the only way to permanently close the rift is from the inside. But if we do this, you won't be able to come back through the gateway. Once the rift is destroyed, it'll collapse for good." Brad nodded. He had already accepted the risks. "I understand." Kira's voice softened, her expression conflicted. "You've saved us once already, Brad. You don't have to do this alone." Brad placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a faint smile. "This is my fight now. I'm the one it's been fixated on. I'll end this." Kira swallowed hard but didn't argue. She knew he was right. "I'll prepare the gateway," she said quietly. "You'll need to act fast once you're inside. If the entity realizes what you're doing, it'll try to stop you." Brad nodded again, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He was about to face a being of unimaginable power in its own domain. The odds were against him, but he had no choice. He had to stop the entity, no matter the cost. The gateway hummed to life once more, its towering archway flickering with the unstable energy of the rift. Brad stood at the edge, clad in his protective suit, the containment device strapped securely to his belt. Kira stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the gateway. "Once you place the containment device at the rift's core, it should collapse the dimensional bridge and trap the entity forever." Brad nodded, taking a deep breath. He glanced at Kira one last time, seeing the worry in her eyes, but also the trust. "I won't let it win," he promised. Without another word, Brad stepped through the gateway and into the rift. The moment he entered the rift, Brad was enveloped by the same swirling chaos he had experienced before. The landscape was a twisting nightmare of shifting shapes and dark energy, but this time it felt more hostile, more aware of his presence. The air around him buzzed with the entity's malevolent intent. Brad moved quickly, his eyes locked on the vortex of dark energy in the distance. The containment device pulsed in his hand, ready to activate as soon as he reached the center of the rift. But the shadows were waiting. As Brad made his way toward the vortex, the shadows began to coalesce, forming into twisted, humanoid shapes that blocked his path. Their eyes glowed with a sickly red light, and their forms seemed to flicker in and out of reality. Brad gritted his teeth and pushed forward, dodging the shadowy figures as they lunged at him. The entity was trying to stop him, but he wouldn't let it. He had come too far to fail now. The closer he got to the vortex, the stronger the pull of the entity became. The shadows swirled around him, their whispers filling his mind with doubt and fear. "You cannot win," the entity's voice hissed in his mind. "This is my domain. You are nothing here." Brad ignored the voice, his focus unwavering. He reached the center of the vortex and quickly activated the containment device, placing it at the heart of the swirling energy. The effect was immediate. The vortex shuddered, and the entire rift seemed to convulse as the containment device began to collapse the dimensional bridge. The shadows let out a deafening shriek, their forms distorting and unraveling as the entity's power was drained. But the entity wasn't finished yet. In one final, desperate act, the dark force surged toward Brad, its shadowy form condensing into a massive, twisted figure. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, filled with rage and hatred. "You will not escape," it roared, its voice shaking the very fabric of the rift. "You will die here with me." Brad's heart pounded in his chest as the entity closed in. He could feel its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him, but he refused to give in. With a final surge of strength, Brad pushed himself toward the gateway. The rift was collapsing around him, the shadows disintegrating as a containment device did its work. The entity's screams echoed through the air, but Brad didn't stop. He reached the gateway, just as the rift collapsed entirely, the dark force imploding into nothingness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a rush of air, Brad stumbled through the gateway and back onto Cello Prime. The gateway flickered once, twice, and then shut down for good. Brad collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. It was over. The entity was gone. Days later, Cello Prime was quiet once again. The station had returned to its normal operations, the dark force that had plagued them finally vanquished. But Brad couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness inside him. The entity was gone, but so was a part of him, the part that had fought so hard to keep it at bay. As he stood in the observation deck, looking out at the stars, Kira approached him, her expression soft. "You did it," she said quietly. "You saved us all." Brad nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but at what cost?" Kira didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew that the battle had left scars that would never fully heal. But for now, the threat was gone, and Cello Prime was safe. For now. Though the rift was sealed and the entity defeated, Brad knew that the universe was vast and filled with dangers they had yet to encounter. The battle for survival never truly ended, and somewhere out there, new challenges awaited. And Brad Davis would be ready for them.